People come to the social sciences and social science research for a lot of different reasons. For me, and I suspect for a lot of people, it was because we saw problems around us that we really wanted to fix. Institutions were breaking down, public trust was breaking down, communities were breaking down. Things were broken, and we wanted to be able to repair them in some way. For me, I was coming from the perspective of someone who'd worked in sort of an engineering or technical field. And although I enjoyed fixing things in that context as well, I didn't feel like that was necessarily adding up to the fixes at a social level that I would have liked. These kinds of intuitions really do matter because the reason we have passion for what we're doing have an effect. It's kind of the emotional and the moral engine that keeps the social sciences going. It's what happens to let scholarship happen. But these kinds of problems are not yet research questions. And so in this video, I want to talk a little bit about that move from, let's say, issues or topics to research questions. And then from there, we'll refine even further. I'm going to keep referring to this idea of a V. We start out very broadly, and we need to do as much as we can to bring it down to bare bones, to the very specific question that may be quite narrow, quite a bit narrower than what you begin with, but is both answerable and has a significant impact on solving some of these problems, or at least informing such solutions. In other words, we're trying to discipline that insight, discipline that passion in a way that's useful. It's not, I can't give you a recipe for that. There is no kind of magic bullet that will get you from broad kinds of interests to specific questions. A lot of this is sort of an inductive process and a creative process. So I can't give you that creativity that will get you down to those pieces, but I can offer some ways of thinking that might help a little bit. We should start at the broadest part of this V, which is sort of this divide between what we might call pure research and applied research. Now, I don't think that divide, this is going to be a recurring theme here. I don't think that divide is a very useful one as a pure divide. I think that a lot of us do a little bit of both. Often, what we might call pure research informs application, and applied solutions often build up towards pure research. So, I mean, we could see this more easily in the natural sciences, right? So, someone who studies problems in physics or biology or I mean, I guess astronomy and particularly, astronomy at a large scale of time or space is almost always a kind of pure form of research, right? Trying to come up with the basic physical laws of the universe doesn't have an immediately applicable outcome. Nonetheless, if we did not have that pure research, many of the things we have come to rely upon would not exist. So, there often are repercussions from that pure research, which is this kind of, especially with funding for research. Why are we funding someone to do this very abstract work? And it's because often that abstract work has outcomes that you can't predict that are very useful. The other side of this is if we solve a problem that's a practical problem, often those can be built up in some ways to these larger questions. To take that back from the natural sciences to the social sciences, the very broad kinds of pure questions are these really big ones that have always been part of behavioral and social sciences. How much of our nature, how much of the way we behave is the result of our social interactions, and how much of it is inborn, how much of it is kind of the operating system we're born with, and how much of it do we acquire. This is the kind of natural man question that was really at the forefront throughout the Enlightenment. Or to quote one person who talks about structuration, what are the structures and the structures that structure those structures? That is structuring structures and structured structures is the actual quote. That is, how is society built up? How does it change over time? Does it construct out of little pieces from below, or are there overarching themes that change from time to time? What holds all these together is they're largely going to be descriptive, not prescriptive, right? We're going to try to say this is the way society works. These are kind of the equivalent of the physical laws of society. That in and of itself is probably a very difficult task. I don't know that it's a possible task. I don't think we have social laws, but at least moving towards those kind of broad conceptions of just how things work, not how they should work, not how we can make it work better, but this is just the way society works. You get some of that in economics as well. This is just kind of the way that things end up being, right? Applied research, by contrast, says, okay, I see some stuff out here that I want to fix. What is to be done? What can we do to repair this? What can we do to make it work better? Both of these are valuable, both inform one another, but they start from different kind of axiology, different kinds of intellectual commitments. Even applied research, though, usually depends on good descriptive models first. So you can't just say, okay, I see a problem here and I'm just going to solve it by patching it. You can. It doesn't work very well, but this is kind of an atheoretical or model-free approach to trying to fix things. Often it's just kind of throwing spaghetti at a wall and hoping that it sticks. It's not systematic. And so a systematic application of research requires models, whether that is large scale grand theory kinds of social science, or it is more applied social science or behavioral science. So for me, my academic hero has long been a sociologist named C. Wright Mills, who wrote a book called The Sociological Imagination. He was following the footsteps of what we might call American sociology, the development of an urban sociology in the United States, and he was very much concerned with kind of addressing what John Dewey called the public and its problems, right? This idea of providing for a more equitable and just and happy and economically providing economic benefits to the broadest variety of Americans possible, particularly in these cities. So, and he said that we need to look kind of at the individual personal troubles. How is a family having trouble? And then the sociological imagination is to look at this, and not just one case but several, and say, okay, how do these add up to a social issue? And so at one level, kind of thinking about your problem and then moving it up to the level of an issue. This isn't just a problem with the families on my block, or George and Sam and Frida. These are not it's not just individual things. These seem to be linked in some way. And can we think about what kinds of issues they may indicate? And so for him, that was the kind of the step towards something. And so I try to kind of follow that pattern as much as possible. That pattern means thinking about models. It means thinking about a somewhat simplified version of how things work in society. So what does it mean to think about a model? When I say a model, what do I mean? I don't necessarily mean a theory, and this is not a class about either theories or models. We're trying to get our way towards the methods here and the context of methods. So many of you probably have an idea in your head about what a model is, but let's just discuss it briefly. Why are people so irrational online? This seems to be a research question, right? It isn't really a research question. We'll get to that, but it is a broad kind of set of orienting topic, right? It sounds like a research question, but it's not yet. It's too vague. It carries too much of my own evaluation in it, kind of my own impression of what's going on online. It's underspecified. It doesn't tell you what I mean by online. It doesn't tell you what I mean by discussion. It doesn't tell you what I mean by irrational. So it's missing too much. So we need a model to kind of put around it to make sense of that question, or any other question I might come up with. How do people become acculturated to a particular platform, for example? And what role might ranking and rating play in that, or upvotes play in that? That's a question I've asked and published on. To what degree is the World Wide Web actually worldwide? It's kind of a research question, but that is a very vague research question. So how do I take that very vague research question and move it to something that is empirically observable, something that is measurable? So to do that, I use a model. What's a model? A model is just a simplified system where you suggest or you guess that there are a number of important objects, units of some sort, and that they interact in some way, that they have some kind of relationship to one another. The whole process of building a model, of thinking about a model, is removing things that are less important. So let's take an example from astronomy. You probably grew up, went to grade school and saw at some point a picture of the solar system, a model of the solar system. Now, this could be most likely it was just a picture of it, right? A couple of circles around things. You might actually have had, a physical model, and something hanging from the classroom ceiling that showed the planets in circles around the sun. You may even have seen something at some point, or a modern version of an orrery that showed the motion of the planets going around the sun. Orreries were very popular as a mechanical device, over actually a period of a couple of centuries. And they were meant to depict this motion, this circuit, this set of orbits around the sun. If you ever get to Tokyo and go to Tokyo Disney Sea, I think the neatest piece of Disney Imagineering is a giant scale orrery in one of the buildings there, where kids can actually hand crank it and watch the planets moving around a sun. It's very cool. Anyway, so that's a very simplified model, and it's wrong. It's wrong for a whole bunch of reasons. The planets are always too big, right? If you think about the size of Mercury as opposed to kind of how far apart it really would be from the other planets, for it to be to scale, it would be, I don't know, depending on the size of your model, it would be a speck, or at best the head of a pin or something, right? So, the planets are the wrong scale. But that's not really important for what you're trying to learn in this. You're trying to learn in this that the sun is in the center of the solar system, and that everything else kind of moves around it. You might assume that all of these are circular orbits. I mean, that's what they are, right? They're circles. But mostly they are. I mean, mostly they are. There's some nuance here, though, which is that that Venus, for example, has a pretty close to a circular orbit, but Mercury again has a more elliptical orbit. In fact, well, if we include Pluto, there are times when Pluto kind of crosses over one of these, and so they aren't actually concentric circles. And beyond that, like if you look at these models, often you've got Mercury, and then the first four planets are kind of pretty close together, and then the circles are not necessarily getting much wider. But if you look, obviously, in terms of scale, if you went out to the Earth, you'd have a big jump before you got out to Mars, and you get a really big jump as you get to the outer planets. It gets wider and wider and wider to a pretty extreme degree. This is very rarely depicted in the pictures because it would, again, make for things confusing. In fact, some of the most famous pictures have them pretty much equally spaced as you go out. Also wrong. You might assume that they are in a perfect plane. I'm going to pick on Pluto again, even though it's not a planet, but whatever. Pluto is actually quite a bit off on that. It's scant. Most of them are roughly in a plane. It's kind of at an angle like this, but that's so in some depictions you'll see that. But in the most popular ones, no, they're all on the same circle, all going around kind of on a flat plate, right? And then there's that, right, which is that they're going around in a circle and that the sun is just sitting there. Now, of course, the sun isn't just sitting there; it's in orbit, right? The sun is in orbit around the center of the Milky Way. Not very quickly. we're hundreds of millions of years for a full orbit, and so it's only going about what, 500,000 miles an hour, something like that. Actually, not that quick in terms of the universe. And then, of course, the center of the Milky Way. Well, I don't know. I think we're actually the center of the Milky Way is pretty close to the center of the local cluster as well. But the local cluster is part of I think it's called the Virgo Mega Cluster. This is not my field, obviously, but it's part of a large neighborhood of galaxies, right? And those are rotating very, very slowly, I guess you could say. Again, this is slow rotation, but very fast speed, depending on what your reference is. And there have been depictions of what this looks like for the solar system as well. But again, we're just ignoring those, and we're not ignoring them because we're ignoring them in this case for two reasons. One, for pedagogical reasons, right? We only want to give people so much information at one time. If you just said everything's spinning around really fast, people wouldn't really get much out of that. So some of it is simplification from a narrative perspective, but some of it is a simplification because that's what you have to do to be able to think about a system. You have to decide which of these pieces are important. Is the fact that the sun is moving important? Important to what? Yeah, it's important in terms of your understanding of the reality of the universe. But in terms of actually getting a rocket from the Earth to Venus, or from the Earth to Mars, it actually doesn't matter that much, because the dynamics that we're dealing with here are really more about where the planets are going, how the planets are moving with reference to one another and with reference to the sun. It does matter how big they are, right? Because you have to kind of plan out when you slingshot around planets, you have to know about their mass. So their mass matters. Does it matter that some of them are gas giants? Well, no. Honestly, no. Not for that. But for other things, yeah, it would. At some point, if you're trying to land on Saturn, that's going to be a problem. So understanding the makeup of these planets might be helpful. Relative size may be helpful. Relative mass might be helpful. Kind of what they look like might be helpful, right? If you know that Saturn has rings, that might be useful to be able to identify it if you happen to have a telescope. So what you keep and what you leave out is, and this was a very long explanation about the solar system, sorry about that, but what you keep and what you leave out is the essential element here. Like there are things that you want to track, there are objects you want to track. Whether we leave Pluto in or take it out is important. Whether we leave or take out its partner, its moon, that's like half its density, is that important? Often you leave the Earth's moon in, but leave out all of the jovial moons, or the moons in some of the other planets. Why do we do that? Well, because our moon matters more to us, I guess, right? So what do we include? What do we exclude in terms of the sort of objects? Objects being a way of thinking about things. Planets are easy to objectify as objects in some ways, but like, what are our units, and which ones are we keeping, and which ones are we going to ignore for now? And then what about those units, the attributes? What are we going to consider about those things, and what things don't matter? Is the fact that Mars looks red, does that matter? It does matter a little. It matters because, again, if we're looking for it, we look up in the sky and see a red planet, a red object, and know that that's Mars. So it does matter a little, especially if you're kind of, for young people who are trying to learn about the planets. So which of these things matters and which doesn't, which of the attributes. And then relationships. That they move in a circle around the sun is the essential sort of thing that we want people to learn at that point. Some of these depictions have them all in a line, and you might imagine that they all kind of move around at the same rate. But if you see an animation or an aura, you kind of understand that some of them are going around quite quickly, and some of them take a long time to make their full trip around the sun. So understanding that, the kind of dynamics of that, is really helpful. Super helpful to kind of realize that sometimes we're much closer to Mars and sometimes we're very, very far away from it. Things like that can be very useful. So again, the objects, the attributes of those objects, and the relationships, I guess that might also be an attribute, I don't know, are the things that we want to think about. And it's as much kind of what we want to include as because when we make those choices about inclusion, we're going to be excluding some elements of that. So we have this model, and it hopefully is a workable way of thinking about a social system in this case. How do we make use of that? So let's go back to that question. People are irrational online. People get irrational online. You can't have rational discussions in discursive places. This bothers me. It really does bother me. One of the things I was very excited about in the early social web was I saw this as kind of this space for potential deliberation and a more rational sort of way of interacting in publics and people becoming more informed and all that kind of high-minded stuff that it did not anticipate TikTok. So when I say that, I can't really proceed until I ask, you're irrational in what way? Under what conditions? Compared to what alternatives? And for that, this is where kind of the creative process of making leaps comes in. Those leaps of induction, or maybe leaps of abduction. Pierce, again, part of the American pragmatist tradition, Pierce kind of comes up with this term abduction. Induction is basically identifying patterns from things that you've observed. And so when we talked about the circle of the hypothetical deductive, it's usually depicted as a circle. Get another model where kind of you come up with a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis, and then there's this little piece on the back end where you hop back up to the hypothesis again. And from observations to hypothesis is this inductive leap, where you hopefully have seen a pattern here, and you might somehow come up with a new hypothesis to test. Pierce originally talked a little bit more about plausible explanations as part of this, right? And so, and in fact, the way he used abduction has been altered somewhat in the way people define it later on. You start asking, what might, this is the might question, what might be influencing this behavior to change it so that it is less or more rational, whatever that means. Could it be sort of cognitive overload? Could it be, you're looking for an opportunity to vent? Could this just be kind of a self-management thing? Hard day at work, I'm going to go yell at people online. Could it be, I don't know, some kind of identity defense, right? I'm not feeling very secure in my view of myself, and so I'm going to go and defend that view against foils online. And so it doesn't really matter if I convince them. I have no motivation to actually compel them to think like I do. I just want to show that division. There's lots of reasons it could be. And we're not testing hypotheses at this point. Right? We're just kind of trying to say, okay, what's a maybe? What are the possible explanations that we could use for this? And when we start to think about those might be's, which I've already started to say, I've started to describe some of these models, right? Some possibilities here of what are some elements that might be playing a role in here? Identity, emotion, stress, cognitive load. These are all pieces that we might want to look at as a model for thinking about how this happens online, right? We're thinking about the parts and their relationships and how they might interact over time, basically. This is also obviously where we start to draw on all those courses you've been taking and all the prior research that we can start to apply with a lot of the models that are coming up. I don't know, would people normally think about cognitive load or identity defense if they hadn't read about this in other contexts, right? What do we think about when we're thinking about sort of why people might move to an emotional argument and out of rationality? Persuasion theory has a very long history. In the Western tradition, it goes back to the Greeks. There's other traditions that have their own argumentation, but I think probably the one most of you and I am most exposed to is this Aristotelian view of logos, pathos, and ethos probably comes up, right? This idea that we have these three pieces that might be additive in some ways in constructing an argument, that we might have that we might draw on pathos, an emotional pathway to try to convince someone of something, that we may draw on ethos as well, but these might actually support one another. And so that's one possibility. There's many of you may have run across, especially if you have a background in psychology or a background in, say, communication research, something called the elaboration likelihood model, ELM, which it's used in persuasion. It tends to be applied to things like advertising a lot, which talks about kind of this central pathway and a peripheral pathway, and says that if the central pathway is the traditional kind of constructing an argument pathway. If I'm looking for a new laptop, I might go and look online and say, what are its capabilities? What graphics card does it have? Look at the specs. Maybe get together a table and start to look at these. But then I see an ad with an actor and really nice shot of them doing very cool things. I don't know what cool things you would be doing with a laptop, but I'm sure someone else can think of a cool thing you can do with that laptop with soaring, a really nice score. BMW hired, actually a bunch of different companies, car companies have hired now famous people to do the scores for their electric car sounds. Like there is no good reason for that, but it does kind of appeal at a more emotional level. And so what ELM suggests is that at some point you might get a break where you leave this central sort of central part where you're just trying to think about the right way to do things, and you might kind of go off to this peripheral path that tends to play more to emotional pieces, right? Um, and so these are two. There are probably dozens of other ways models others have used to think about persuasion, discussion, sort of the questions of debate. We have a very long history in this area, but those are a couple that we might want to draw from. And it's not necessarily that I cover all of those, or that I kind of pick one that has to be my winner. But what I can do is use these theoretical lenses to start to identify what components I think might be important in my own model. These models aren't neutral, right? They're theory laden by design. They have ideas built into them. Um, this is probably the wrong place to depart on this, but we've talked maybe a little bit about elsewhere about Kuhn and this question of paradigm shifts. And part of that is because people have a standard model, and sometimes that standard model ignores really important stuff. And so a lot of the theoretical sort of the assumptions of a set of theories are built into this model. So you are abbreviating things a little bit when you do this, and it does end up bringing in the assumptions, and not necessarily poor assumptions, but in many cases evidence-based assumptions that have been built into that theory when you take some of this on. Once you have some kind of at least a mental model of what some of these components might be that are influencing whatever the question is you're trying to ask, now you need to kind of really start to set boundaries around what it is you're studying and define the terms that you're using. So, we have this idea that people are irrational. What do we mean by online? Well, I don't know. When people interact online, that's not putting any better a limit on it, right? Or does a conversation on a phone count? Is that online? Does a chat in a text count? Is that online? Well, no, probably, but maybe what we're thinking more is kind of discussion boards of some sort where people interact, and maybe what we do to do that is we draw it specifically on one platform. And I will say, like the earlier question about how do people acculturate to a platform, I did that on Dig. And my gut reaction here is to say, let's look at Reddit for this. And why? Because that's where I go when I see people being irrational. I mean, that's I'm sure there's other places where that happens, but for me, like, people on Reddit get into arguments, and they very quickly devolve into mudslinging, and often do not convince one another, and certainly do not feel either rational, which is the term I've been using, or sort of, I guess we could say, civil. Those are probably two different things, right? So what do we mean when we say online? Well, for the purposes, and this is a key thing, for the purposes of the research I'm doing here, I start to narrow. I'm going to look at Reddit. I will admit part of that is convenience, exposure. This is what I'm most familiar with. Convenience. If you've been in 510 with me, we've already collected data, so I have a feeling it'll be easy to collect that data. It's a serious problem in the field that for a long time, a lot of the platforms that we looked at, like Twitter, was desperately overstudied because it was so easy to get data from it. That's true of Reddit now. It's overstudied for what it is. A lot of spaces are understudied. There's really a lot of interesting stuff that can be done around something like some of the neighborhood apps. Certainly, I still think, even though this is changing, that a lot of the TikTok and Instagram and those kinds of things are still understudied given how widely they're used. So there's a danger here, which is by cutting that off down to this one platform, I may be biasing towards that. The other part of it is, as I said, the earlier one I did was Dig. I think there are some generalizable pieces about Reddit. I think Reddit's part of a tradition of platforms going back to Usenet and Slashdot, and through things like Fark and Corrosion. It's a particular genre of online interaction that I think even when it dies, and it will die as these things do, it'll be, one of the previous ones was Dig. So I've done research. One of my most cited articles is a piece of research that I did on Dig. It does not really matter, called Do Dug Diggers Dig Diligently? It does not really matter that it was on Dig, pretty much moribund or maybe completely gone platform at this point, because a lot of the ideas of it still carry through. So it is generalizable, at least within this genre, right? So maybe I start with that. Now I've gone from why are people online irrational to why do discussions, I moved that a little bit from people to discussions. Why do discussions online why do discussions on Reddit devolve into irrational arguments? I probably should, I'm not going to look at Reddit as a whole, but we'll kick that down we'll kick that can down the line a little bit. I might want to think about sort of, I've made a small change there. Why do they turn irrational? This suggests that something happens over time where they might they might start being logical and then move to being irrational. Uh, we'll come back to that as well. That may be an unwarranted assumption on my part. So what we're trying to do is kind of what do we mean by irrational? I mean, I can think of some things. What's the marker of an irrational argument? I might say, an argument that lacks internal consistency, for example, or an argument that, where I agree with you that X, Y, and Z, and they all fit together, but I don't care. Like this sort of rejecting it outright. This could be an emotional appeal. Well, that's great for you to say, but you didn't have a kid die. This could be kind of an appeal to authority. That can happen in two ways. An appeal to authority is fallacy, right? If you say, well, my pastor, my parent, my whatever said this, they don't have any particular expertise in this, so that's one form of an irrational one. But if you also say doctors don't know anything, that's a sort of if you reject a legitimate authority, then that's another kind of irrationality, right? So we could come up with a list here. It could be as simple as using language that is more abusive or less civil. Again, this chart starts to tread over from rationality to civility, but maybe those two are related in some way. Now, what we're starting to do here is start to think about whether we have observable dimensions, things that we can actually observe that feed into that broad statement, getting narrower and narrower. And somewhere along the line here, we need to do the gut check, or in this case, I think at this point it's the Google Scholar check, right? I have now advised 30 years of graduate students who have a great idea, and then their whole world is shattered because someone else has already done it. And that's the sad story here, which is, and often done it better. That's the sad story here, which is, 99 out of your 100 brilliant ideas have already been thought about by somebody else. And of those, I wouldn't put it that high. I'd say at least half are better than what you could have done on it, and I feel your pain. This is something that I've done as well. I will tell you that pain is far greater if you invest several weeks or several months or a year of your life in investigating something only to find someone who's done it better. So early on, it's worth kind of doing a quick Google check, a Google Scholar check in particular, and see, use some of the words you're using and see who has already done this. Of course, this is going to inform your work as well, right? But you may find someone already has something. So if I were going to use the ELM, elaboration likelihood model, I could just go over to Google Scholar and find, yep, people have obviously used this model to look at Reddit. And so I'm not the first one to come up with this idea. This is not a problem. And this is actually, despite the ego blow that will be that I was not the first to think of this, it's actually, there is more than a silver lining here. You've just basically produced the core of a lit review, for one thing, right? Because if people have already done this, you can look at the literature and think about the models they've used, think about the way they've defined irrationality if they have, or uncivility if they have. Think about actually the methods they've used. This is really key because you can steal them, borrow them, whatever. Borrowing methods is a good thing to do. Figuring out how people have done things in the past and repeating that in a slightly different context is the mix and repeat that makes social science happen. So all of these are good things to have in front of you. You're still then faced with the problem that your research question has already been addressed. But this is again where we get to narrow it. I will tell you, once you give me your research question, you still need to narrow it. It doesn't matter how narrow it is. I used to have a sign over my office door that said narrower is better on a very thin surfboard. Narrower is better. So you're going to want to kind of refine this and get it narrower, get it sharper, get it more specific at each stage. If you look at some of these articles, you don't have to read them. Again, at this point, you should be pretty good at skimming is the wrong word. I think maybe gutting these articles and finding out what's useful. And one of the things you might want to be looking for that's useful is in your standard, read the abstract, read the intro, read the conclusion, read the bibliography. You probably want to go back and look at the methods for the reason I just noted, look at the methods section and see how they're doing it. But just before they reach their final conclusion, they probably have some suggested areas of research, things that they could not conclude from the evidence they saw. This is a pretty standard sort of thing to do within a research report, is to say, and this opens up, these research is supposed to be generative as well. So these are questions that might be worth looking at. And often the people who are writing this, what they're saying is, next I'm going to write about this. So that's fine. But it can also be a hint as to how you might refine your question and help to answer the question they couldn't, right? So you need to take this as your opportunity to go a little bit narrower, look at a very specific set of this question. So for example, we might be narrower in time. What is the triggering event right before someone moves from a rational to an irrational argument? Again, let's assume right now, maybe this is in the literature, I don't know, I've looked at it. Maybe in the literature we know that sometimes there are rational arguments that start that way. Maybe it's not that uncommon. but maybe a lot of them end up moving to becoming irrational. I know on Reddit, moderators will eventually just kind of say, okay, enough, and lock comments because you've hit this lock point where people are just bouncing against each other and you're not getting anywhere. So where does that start? Is there a triggering event? Can you measure that triggering event? Maybe that's a way we sharpen it. We look for a very specific point here, a point that's particularly important, that decisive point where we might move away. How do we measure that? How do we look for that? What kinds of things can we look for as indicators? What are potential triggers? What does the literature tell us about the potential triggers? What should we be looking for? And then how do we do that, right? And at this point, we are narrowing towards the methods we might use. We still have to think about measures. We still have to think about specific methods, but we're kind of, we have some ideas, I think. At least if you're thinking along with me on this, you might have some ideas about, what does this mean for what we would look at? If we're looking for those triggers, maybe we and are looking for those breakpoints, maybe we think about there are a bunch of ways we could do this. We could bring a bunch of people in. If I were a psychologist, I'm not. My first gut reaction would be, let's bring a bunch of people into the lab and watch them engage in this, and then we could do once they're in the lab, we have them physically there. We can do all kinds of things to them, right? We can measure their blood pressure or their heart rate and see if it changes just before they go onto this emotional track. We can measure their gaze. What are they looking at? And figure out if we can see a change in their gaze or their physical posture. We can stop them right when they start to do something that we've identified as being on the peripheral track. We can stop them and say, oh, well, what made you decide to write that? Right. This is the sort of talk and type, that sort of thing you might do when you're doing UX research. You could manipulate this in some way, right? Once you had some set of things that you thought were triggers, you could have someone in another room who is a confidant actually insert these into a fake version of Reddit and see if you could trigger someone into moving into this space. So this is some sort of an observational or experimental method. You could do a survey, right? As soon as you saw someone do it, or as soon after as possible, you could send them a note on Reddit and say, why did you say this? I've done something a little bit like this in some of my research, where I wanted a little more detail, where I reached out to certain people and said, why did you? Who are you, and what are you saying about this, right? So we could do that. We could direct message them and say, hey, we saw this conversation. What made you choose to do this right at this moment? For reasons I'll mention later on, that tends not to be something I would do. My gut here would be to say, can we do this purely through the text itself? Is there something that we can see and extract from the text that shows when things are about to go wrong? And that's very vague right now. And I think it would have to be vague until I looked in more detail and started to really dive into some examples of this so that I could start to find it and then refine further. I just want to push on this idea that I think people come to research reports where there's a hypothesis and a lit review, and then a hole is found, someone has identified a known unknown in the literature, and then they come up with a hypothesis and they test the hypothesis and they have findings and they have a conclusion, and it's all so neat and tied up in a bow, and that is not how the sausage is made. It's always this back and forth. You're doing a lit review as you're doing the methods. You're often, collecting data and realize you have to change things a bit. You collect the pilot data and you realize that you've missed something. You go out and start to mush through this. It's a very mushy, chaotic process that does not show in the final report. It's a just so representation of your findings that kind of covers up some of the messiness. It's unfortunate in some ways because I think it's really useful for people to see that messiness, but that's not usually how science is communicated. So at this point, we can start to move towards like what method are we using, and also how, once we have specified some of this, we move from the specification of what it is we're trying to measure, and then we have to really start to think about measurements. I'll take a short break here, and we'll go on to that in the next one. But at the model level, we need to make sure that we are again identifying what are our objects of study. Are they people? That's very common for social groups. Are they communities? And then what are we trying to measure about this? Maybe we're not using people. Maybe we're using users, which may not be the same as people. Maybe we're using conversations as our kind of unit that we're looking at. Well, how are we going to define a conversation on Reddit? Like, is it there's some work on Usenet, for example, that talked about you can use Usenet news groups, which are the same as subreddits in some ways. They're kind of communities, but looked at thread depth, right? How many back and forths? Maybe that's how you do it. Maybe you only look at conversations that have X number of people participating, or maybe you look at it only at ones where you have a back and forth that goes at least 3 times, or at least X number of times. So kind of very clearly identifying what the piece is that you're looking at it for your model, and then what is it that you need to know about this? Like, what are the objects? What do you need to know about these objects? And then if there are relationships, and there usually are, what kinds of relationships are you looking for, right? And inherent to all of this is the method question: how am I going to measure that? And the metrics part: what are those measurements going to look like?